All right, so introducing you guys to the 5 models of motor control. So essentially each chapter is dedicated to a model of motor control. So the next few videos, I'm going to just introduce you to some of the concepts and strategic applications that I've used in each model of motor control as a quick summary before we get into chapter 1, which is the trenches of my beliefs and values. Let's talk about or define motor control. So motor control can basically be boiled down to inputs or sensory information traveling to the central nervous system, being processed, and then an output is delivered. So we got inputs, processing, and outputs. And each model of motor control essentially has its own twist or its own perspective as to how we can influence these inputs and outputs. So the ecological model of motor control. The ecological model was ignited by a psychologist of the name James Gibson in 1966. And Gibson was really interested in how we detect, filter, and perceive information from our environment that's relative to our goal, and how we use that information to control our movement. Now, this is really interesting because before Gibson, everyone was looking at the sensory motor and the biomechanical systems to try to explain how we control movement. And now Gibson came along and said, well, wait a minute, how does the environment and our goal orient and control our behavior? Motor control. So the question I've been struggling with for the last several years was, how can I do better to empower my clients to change? What am I missing? I don't know about you guys, but one of my biggest struggles is getting people to commit to changing their behavior towards healthier habits for the long term, whether that be getting out for a daily walk, committing to a strength training routine, or doing their home exercise program in terms of physical therapy. And when I started really learning about Gibson's approach and reading about the ecological model and listening and learning about behavior change psychology, motivational interviewing, I started to open up my eyes and say, well, wait a minute, this is, I think, what I'm missing. And this is what led me down the path of really fine-tuning my processes to tailor it to behavior change. Okay, so if we listen to behavior change psychologists, what we'll learn is that people's reflexive response to change is fear. So fear is a reflex response to change. And if you listen to Robert Sapolsky and read his book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, he does a really good job at explaining this fight or flight response physiologically. So a professional proposes change to a client. I want you to do this exercise program 5 days a week. Oh, and by the way, try to go out and walk a little bit more. So change is proposed, the client goes into a reflex fear response. The sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight response is activated. The hypothalamus releases corticotropic releasing hormone. That triggers the anterior pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal glands to release glucocorticoids, norepinephrine, and epinephrine in our bloodstream. So that all happens in seconds as a reflex when we present change to our clients. My question is, how can we go about reducing this reflex fear response when we present change to our clients? How can we convert this fight or flight response to change to more strategic problem solving and this sense of curiosity and experimentation when it comes to change rather than this willpower drill sergeant approach? All right. So the two different components of behavior change that I get into in the book, or in this chapter of the book, these are areas that I've been working on myself for the last few years. So this is by no means a comprehensive look at behavior change psychology or motivational interviewing. These are the components that I've integrated into my intake process. These are the things that for the last several years I've been applying to myself to try to adopt healthy habits and eliminate bad habits, and also with my clients. And these are the things that I'm finding a lot of results with, and I'm quite excited to share with everyone else. So communication and goal setting is the two areas where I really started to zoom in on with this. The intake process, specifically under communication, and really investigating the art of questions and the art of asking questions, how to ask better questions, how to ask the right questions at the right time, and really figuring out this algorithm in terms of when someone responds to this question with this, well, what question can we ask them next? And knowing that there's an art behind that and a science to really glean from the patient or the client what their goals are, what their motivations are, what do they value, and what are their struggles and what have their struggles been in working with other healthcare professionals. And really getting a good understanding of all of that so that we can tailor everything to that. That's the first part. The second part is then going down the path of goal setting with the client. So there's 5 key areas that I talk about in this chapter in regards to goal setting. Number 1 is the difference between lag and lead metrics. And a lag metric is basically a metric that is perseverative on the outcome or the results. So in our world, it would be a range of motion or a pain score. Whereas a lead metric is more of a biomarker to behavior change. So for example, it's tracking weekly volumes, for example. Like if I'm working with an athlete, how many minutes a week do they spend in certain heart rate zones if we're really trying to develop certain levels of conditioning and energy systems. If I'm working with a physical therapy client that needs to improve their mobility, is how often do they commit to their mobility routine each week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week. And using those metrics can really help us focus on behavior rather than focus on results. We can decrease this person's fear response because it's very unlikely that a true mobility restriction, for example, is going to change week to week. The next aspect of goal setting is using what Dr. Krista Scott Dixon calls the confidence scale, or just assessing the person's confidence about how likely it is for them to accomplish the weekly goal that we set. And if their confidence is anything less than an 8 out of 10, for example, we need to make that goal smaller to reduce that fear response. Next is setting expectations, or in other words, looking at the person's mindset in terms of failure and not achieving a goal. This is basically shifting someone's mindset to that of experimenting rather than drill sergeant, I have to hit the goal or else I'm a failure. When we fall short of a goal, sometimes it can be circumstantial or contextual based on life happening that week, or it can be an opportunity to learn something about how we're setting the goal or the strategies that we're trying to utilize in terms of establishing the goal. So a really helpful tool that I've got from Dr. Kelly McGonigal, a psychologist out of Stanford, is something called the 3 E's of experimentation, where we look at the environment, ease, and enjoyment. Is the environment supportive of the goal? Can we use visual aids to help us or help remind us of our goal? How easy is it? Again, that's where the confidence scale can fit in. And if they find it 8 out of 10 difficult, or they find it extremely hard to execute, maybe we have to make the goal smaller. So how easy is it? Using the 5 or 10 minute rule can help in terms of time. And then enjoyment. Does this habit give them joy? Does it allow them to smile? Can we make it joyful for them? Can we include their favorite playlist, people that they enjoy being around? So these are all ways to, again, reduce that fear response. And then finally, we have using a habit tracker. The habit tracker simply X's consecutively being put on a calendar can help us overcome times where we're not seeing progress or we're just not feeling motivated to continue. You see those X's on the fridge and you're like, meh, gotta do it. I gotta keep the streak going. And then I lied. Now, finally, next action steps, discussing next action steps with the person to give them confidence as to exactly what they need to do to move the needle forward next time, and really defining that before the end of each session. So I gave you a little sneak peek in terms of applicable strategies in each one of these, but in the book, I go in a little bit deeper and share some experiences with you guys to really help make it stick. Okay, so each model of motor control has its limitations. And the goal of this book is to highlight strengths and weaknesses of each so we can use other models to fill in the blanks of a certain model's limitations. So the glaring limitation of the ecological model is it's very psychosocial heavy. It's focusing on the environment, it's focusing on goals, and it's focusing on behavior. Super helpful. However, it neglects the sensory motor and the biomechanical systems. And we can utilize the other models of motor control to help fill in the gaps here. But if we're just using the ecological model and only in that department of motor control, we may actually miss a lot of other aspects in terms of tapping into our client's potential. All right, so that's basically how the ecological model looks at inputs, processing, and outputs. If the output is behavior change, then we look at inputs as our intake and establishing confidence and using confidence scales and using habit trackers and using all these different strategies to influence input or to influence the environment, which then influence the input to the central nervous system. If the central nervous system is not in a fight or flight response and it's more into this strategic problem solving response, it may actually perceive information coming from the environment differently to ultimately change output or behavior. So I found that perspective of motor control extremely fascinating, and I'm really excited to dive a little bit deeper when we get into this chapter of the book. Thank you guys so much for listening. Next up, we're going to talk about the reflex model of motor control and what Dr. Sherrington brought to the table.